So here's the big question. We always see a blip coming into July 4th. Did we see it? If we saw it, what's next on the agenda? Today on the Logistics Life. Dean, my man, welcome back. Really excited today because I know we've been talking for a couple of weeks now about, typically rates start rising coming into July 4, Canada Day, Independence Day. And then after which it's kind of a little bit like a roller coaster where it goes off the edge of a cliff. And hopefully we got a parachute, brother. I'm like, you got this one, then you got the reserve parachute, then you got the other one, then you got the other one. You're constantly pulling parachutes. So where are we at, brother? What's happening?
Well, we actually did see a bit of a produce season peak, even though produce volumes are down about 9%. We still don't have USDA data in because of the short week last week. So, being a public holiday short week, we probably won't see a USD update on the exact volume for the week of 7/4, but we're about 9% behind leading into July 4. So, less volume. Less volume had me worried that we'd be seeing kind of a non-event in terms of produce season. Well, from a rate perspective, we actually saw pretty much what we see every single year. I looked at some of the data this week on the rate side. Dry van rates were flat, so that wasn't any surprise because they'd had a reasonably good run up. But they were identical to this time last year. Refrigerated rates, though, which is sort of the big beneficiary of produce season, they went up 2 cents a mile last week, which again is interesting in and of itself. I'd thought rates would have peaked the week before. They certainly started to flatten out towards the end of last week. Dan, they're sitting about 3 cents a mile lower than last year, but there's 15% more loads moving in our network. So whenever you see more volume like that to that degree and rates up a little bit, it tells you that capacity is starting to tighten a little bit. So I went back and looked at if rates were at $2.04 a mile, excluding fuel, so that's line haul rates, what does that mean in the context of the July 4 seasonal peak? And if we go back to mid-April when we talked about produce season starting, remember we talked about Vidalia onion pack date. When they start announcing the packing of the Vidalia onions for their very short season in those, I think it's 13 counties in Georgia, that's kind of our unofficial starting line of the produce season. When I look at the change in rates from mid-April to July 4, that kind of defines the produce season impact. Line haul rates increased 19 cents a mile over those 11-week periods this year. So I went back and said, well, okay, if it's up 19 cents a mile, in some years you'll recall it's been as high as 25 cents a mile, but it was up 19 cents a mile, so not too bad. But compared to the average in prior produce seasons going all the way back to 2016, this year's increase is just a penny per mile higher. So pretty much exactly what we'd expect out of the produce season happened in terms of the movement in spot rates. So that's pretty good news because in prior years, Dan, we've had non-existent peaks. Going back to 2019, for example, we saw hardly any movement in spot rates. They were pretty flat all the way through that 11-week period. So what that tells me is capacity starting to tighten. And that's been a theme that we've been talking about in the last few weeks is spot market capacity is exiting the market. That means that there's fewer trucks whenever you see a bump in demand like this and rates go up. You'll probably see the same thing out of Texas this week because of Hurricane Beryl. That will have an impact. So whenever you have this sort of, we've had 27, 28 months of carriers leaving the market. At some point, it doesn't take much of a demand bump to drive the rates higher. And remember, we had the polar vortex in January, 12 cent per mile up. We had road check week, 10 cents per mile, week over week gain. Produce season, 19 cents a mile lift over 11 weeks. So that tells me that we're getting to this point in the market cycle where those that are trying to source capacity are going to find it harder through the rest of this year And in particular on our IQ show yesterday, we had Paul Brashear from ITS Logistics. He's in Houston. He gave us a really good update on Hurricane Beryl, but he was talking about imports, and he was saying that people are pulling forward more imports, and because capacity is tight, his theory is on the ocean side, when people are pulling forward inventory to get ahead of, strikes on the East Coast. There's also a bit of a panic going on overseas because of limited capacity to get containers on ships. I always go back to your bed sheet story. I think it was bed sheets you had to move, right? So what we're seeing is, if you look at the US market, it's really calm, and I said to Paul, "Is this the calm before the storm?" And he said, "Absolutely," because the ocean carriers have tightened capacity, which meant shippers trying to bring freight in have limited slots, so rates are going up. And what that'll force importers to do to get ahead of peak holiday season inventory, uh, is they'll be pulling that forward as far as they can into July. He thinks you'll start to see a surge in imports coming in July for the holiday season inventory stocking phase, because there's limited capacity on the ocean. And he said what will happen is that will push a lot more volume into the transloading market. So, which you think about Savannah, New Jersey, Ontario market. So, it's a really interesting data point. He also thought your neck of the woods, well, not quite, but Prince Rupert, Vancouver, even Seattle in the Pacific Northwest, will see more volume come in. So it's a great listen. If you want to listen to the show, Paul Brashear from ITS Logistics gave us a really good sense of what sort of impact we should see the rest of the year. The reason I bring that up is that if capacity is tightening on the road side, you will see spot rates surge in those markets where there's an overflow of volume, just like we did in Los Angeles during the pandemic. So that's sort of where we sit right now. Spot rates will probably flatline now for a little while until we get to some sort of a market inflection, which could be a hurricane. It could be a surge in imports into a particular port. I asked him which ports in particular brokers and 3PLs should be watching for that might not be on their radar. He mentioned the big ones that we just covered, Ontario, Savannah, New York, but he was adamant that we're going to see some pretty serious action in the Pacific Northwest, because it's a full day's sailing closer from China to the US than Los Angeles. Now, you've got a Canadian rail strike looming up there too. So that could throw a spanner in the works, because
Yeah.
you've got a lot of freight that goes into Chicago.
I have the opinion when it comes to these rail strikes and everything. The government gets involved typically before anything major really happens. I mean, don't get me wrong. People are going to start is when it's coming, because it's coming closer. So people are going to start moving from rail to OTR 1000%. Everyone does. They always do it, because the last thing they want is stuff getting stuck in transit and being part of somebody else's problem, right? But it's interesting you bring that up. I've had a couple of conversations this week already with customers. Everyone has really positive things to say about the market, and like one company in particular, having talks with them a couple of months ago, they're like, "Dan, we're struggling," and now he's like, "Dude, we're getting busier and busier and busier, and there's more opportunity coming to the table." Another one that I was speaking with yesterday, actually. She's got a really big opportunity, and the customer wants to lock in for 2 years.
Oh,
And I was like, whoa, 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 hold on. I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I go, like, I understand that, and it's a really big opportunity, like double-digit loads every day. And I said, I understand. I said, I get it. And I said, I don't want to be the Debbie Downer here, but I go, just understand, like, we're starting an upswing. We're at the bottom. So add something into your terminology, into your communication, have an understanding that things are going to change, and when they do, we will need to change with the market. Now, I also believe, though, Dean, and one thing I did say, and this is for everyone out there that's maybe in a position like this, like if you're looking at doing something for 2+ years, you're not going in at market rates today. you're always adding something in. Like I remember throughout probably the last decade and a half of my career, anytime a customer said, I want an all-in rate, I'd say, okay, fuel's at 15%. So I'm going to average 20% fuel. I'm going to build that into the rate. If fuel goes to 25%, we're going to have a conversation. And that was written right into the documentation. So they wanted an all-in rate. I'm not doing it at today's levels. And like you just can't. You physically can't do it at today's levels with what's coming down the pipe. And I mean, even if, you know, knock on wood, it doesn't happen. But even if, say, the market doesn't turn for 3 months, that's 2 years. That's 24 months. There's no way this market's staying the way it is for
No.
4 to 5 years. It just won't.
Dan, that would be they'll get crushed. They'll be in at a rate, and then they won't be able to buy capacity under the rate that quoted. Like that's. I mean, that's
and margins are slim. Like you got to understand. Yeah, margins are slim as it is, right? Like we're talking $50, $60 margins.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, if you have one, very low. So if you have one carrier and it's like one load sheet for the week, or, you know, because you got to think of invoice costs per order, right?
Right.
I've done deals like this before where it's like, okay, there's 27 orders, but it's one load sheet, 27 orders, you're making $50-$60 an order. Right. That's a profitable order on a distribution. Right. But when you're having to do multiple load sheets, multiple invoicing, multiple PODs, multiple this, it starts adding up. And if your margins are that slim, and she understood, she was like, no, I get it. She's like, I really want the business. I said, no, I understand. And this is the juxtaposition, right? Is you really want the business, but it's like when you're losing all this money, you don't want the business anymore. But right now, people want the business.
Dan, that's nuts. You could see the shipper saying, we'll give you 20 loads a day, and we want to rate for 2 years. Like that's a recipe for disaster. Like
and I think it's a recipe disaster for everyone, because if a shipper gets that deal now, they're getting the deal because it works for the person they're making the deal with right now. But I look at it, Dean, and I look back, I mean, vividly remember 2018, 19. And I know we say, the anomaly years, but I remember the amount of people I spoke to that got into RFPs in 2018. They were like, dude, I locked in capacity for the next year. I locked in loads for the next year. And as soon as the market turned, shippers went back to the spot market and literally dropped everybody on their RFPs. And as soon as it turned back, they were like, oh, well, your RFP is valid. And they're like, no, hold on. You dropped me like a sack of potatoes at the edge of PEI because you think you had better in PEI. And now you're coming back to me. And I see that's going to happen as well. I mean, you're going to see the rejection rate skyrocket on a lot of these RFPs that people are.
Yeah, you're going to see routing guide failures like pretty big time. I mean, they've been at historic low levels. They're bumping up around 5% now if you look at FreightWave's outbound tender reject index. So 5% still historically low. But when you start to get to a normal market, it's probably closer to 10%. But you will see 20 to 25% rejection rates pretty quickly. I think that's always been our theory this year, Dan, is that this exact scenario would happen as shippers drive the market down and people are trying to get volume and they're bidding low on the way down in the market cycle. When capacity turns, carriers are saying, hey, I got better opportunities on the spot market. You can keep that freight. And that's the danger that shippers play going on the downside of the market. And, of course, everybody's getting crushed in terms of margins on the way down in this cycle. But we're clearly at the bottom of that cycle with signs of things improving. I don't have the latest capacity numbers, but at some point after October, so we're 18, 19 months of losing 7,000 to 8,000 carriers a month. At some point, you're left with the stalwarts of the industry who have been through multiple freight cycles, who are not going to haul for nothing. And that's where you're seeing the floor in dry van and reefer rates. You're seeing the rates sit at about where the lowest common denominator carrier can operate economically without not being able to pay their fuel or insurance bills, and that's where we're at right now. My average operating costs are about $1.80 a mile. If I own my own truck and trailer, it's $1.50, right? So if you think where spot rates are right now, you could still make money at $1.70 a mile line haul rates, but you're not going to be able to do it for long because you're not generating enough return on equity. So that's sort of, yeah, that's the seasonality piece, Dan. We're in the dog days of summer, though, right? So this is I know there's some green shoots that we're talking about, but manufacturing is going to be the key, and we're not really seeing strong manufacturing numbers. But my wife's catering business in this week in July, nothing's happening. Everybody's at the beach, right? So this July is typically a fairly slow month, but I think we'll
And then
start.
you got construction shutdown coming up at the end of the month. And then August is typically one of the largest months for vacations, which is going to then start. I mean, I'm speaking to a couple of people now, and it's interesting because I'm having a lot of talks with like FEMA and stuff. And a ton of them are on vacation. And then you're speaking to one, they're like, well, I'm in this week, but I'm out next week. They're back, and it's like this fractured communication throughout the pipeline is, I think. I mean, it's. But you know what, Dean? In the end, I think it occurs every summer, right? Like I think it's something we as salespeople need to be prepared for, and need to start figuring out. Like I was having a conversation with a gentleman, and he's like, Dan, nothing's happening, nothing. And I'm like, okay. I go, are you confident in what you're doing? And he goes, 1,000%. I go, how confident? He goes, like, 1,000,000%. I said, okay. The next person you call, tell them you can do this. If not, it's free. He's like, no. And I'm like, yeah. I go, like, is anyone else offering anything for free? He goes, no. I go, so how do you get through to somebody? Make them an offer they can't refuse. If I mess up the order and I don't do what you've asked me to do, barring, you're trying to go into Houston or something during a hurricane, well, different story. And so he made 3 phone calls after we hung up the phone yesterday, got 3 companies that said, all right, quote me on this. Yeah. Yeah. And here's the thing, right, Dean, is what you just talked about is the rates are going to start climbing. I think right now, shippers are, for all of you shippers out there that are watching, please tell us in the comments below, like share with us if this is reality, because I might just be blowing smoke, but it's my own personal opinion. I think you're getting ready for what's coming. I think a lot of shippers are seeing the market because, like we've talked about many times, shippers have way more data now than they've ever had in their life. So they're seeing these signs of things shifting. And now I think even more than ever is a time where we as sales reps got to get in front of these people and offer them, like, put your money where your mouth is. Like, offer them something that is irrefutable, and they have to listen. Like, it's like Steve Martin said, be so good they can't ignore you. And I think that's the key to what we're facing right now, personally.
I'm just looking up the shipper data I got the week of, let me just quickly open this up. I've got the week of my latest contract rates for shippers have, so this is as of 7/11. So this is interesting. Dry van rates, replacement rates, Dan, are still coming in down 1.9%, temp control down 2%. So these are replacement rates. So this is how we define a replacement rate at DAT. When we see so this is a shipper buy, shipper to carrier, shipper to broker buy. When we see that rate for the very first time on a lane, we say, that's a new rate replacing the old rates. And we measure the rate of change because the old rate was in the routing guide from the previous RFP. So the new rates coming in for the week of 7/11 are down 2% for dry van and reefer. So they're 2% lower than the rates they're replacing. So you're talking about the shipper mentality of wanting a 2-year deal. They know this market's going to turn because we've moved from double-digit decreases to low single digits. Now, you'll recall we've been low single digits now for a month, right? So
Yep.
It's still dropping.
Over that, I think, hasn't it been like 2
could
months where we've seen
longer.
low single?
Yeah,
or mid digits last month, or May, and then June was low single. Yes, it was like mid range for May, I think.
So shippers have still got pricing power, and what they're trying to do now, of course, isn't that example you gave us, is they're trying to commit carriers as far out as they can because they know rates are going to start going up as soon as those routing guide failures start to turn. Flatbed, though, Dan, we talked about this on the show a little while ago. I think flatbeds are going to be really diabolical this year. I think you're going to find plenty of capacity in flatbed. I think that market is going to turn because the replacement rates in flatbed are coming in 6% lower. I
Wow.
think
Well,
contract
but
rates are
typically
dropping.
flatbed didn't move very much when the dry van rates were bottoming out,
Correct.
right?
Correct. Yeah, so I think there's going to be fairly soft demand on the contract side for flatbed. Now, what could counter that is there could be a bunch of carriers that say, you know what, to heck with this flatbed, let's get under a dry van or a reefer. So you may see some capacity migration, and even though demand drops, rates may go up because there's fewer trucks. That could happen also. So it's a very interesting time. I think we're in for a real roller coaster ride this next 6 months. I think it won't take much to change this market. We've got road. It's not road check week. It's what do they call it? They call it brake safety week, coming up on August 25. So it's like road check week, right, where everyone took the week off. August 25 will be another week where carriers will take time off. It's at the end of a month when shippers like to move more volume off their docks. So you'll see capacity tighten around big events like that, same as we saw with Road Check Week. And that's going
What
to.
do you think's going to happen? Like I don't know if you read the article on the weekend about FEMA. Um, their budget this year for disaster relief and already spent $23 million this year positioning materials and products. And then, with hurricanes coming into Texas and this kind of stuff, um, I know we've talked a few times, and I'd love your thoughts on it. We're like one natural disaster away from really turning a market, and I'm wondering if this hurricane coming into Texas is going to move the.
Well, no, it won't.
Like,
This one won't.
what would have to happen in
Yeah.
your mind for it to move the needle?
A sustained flooding event in a big market like Houston, for example. This skirted around the Gulf of Mexico, and Paul Brashear on our show yesterday said and quote, much needed rain was his comment. So in Houston in particular, it was mostly a rain, fairly reasonable wind event, but they got a lot of rain, which they said they needed. So he said the ports were closed today. The ports were closed yesterday, but they reopen again pretty quickly. The difference, Dan, this was a fast moving storm. So it wasn't a prolonged flooding event. So what would move the needle is a slow moving storm with very low barometric pressure. So when it sits and spins like it's done over Houston and other parts of the country, that's when you start to see a market moving event, right? In particular, when it hits the oil industry, because you've got almost half of our oil production comes from the Gulf Coast and Texas. And when it comes up through the Gulf, they've got to move all those offshore oil rigs into harbour, along the Gulf Coast. So when you see that type of event, that's when you see supply chain disruptions, because that will disrupt the chemical industry and gasoline production all along the Gulf Coast. And then you start to see flooding events hitting refineries. They're the sorts of things you've got to watch. Not so much a flooding event along the Florida coast, smaller freight markets. Most of their oil comes in by barge. Their fuel goes in from barge from the Gulf Coast into Tampa and the Everglades. So it's not a balanced market. So it's Florida's a lot of inbound, not as much outbound. Whereas you've got more balanced markets along the Gulf Coast and Texas. So you see more impact on freight lanes along the Gulf Coast and Texas than you would in Florida, because it's not a balanced. There's not a balanced freight flow north-south and south-north.
So, like for other areas, the Carolinas, the Georgias, the Kentuckys, the Floridas, the needle mover would be massive damage where there's tons of cleanup and tons of rebuilding and infrastructure fixes, right? That would move the needle. Okay.
So Dan, you normally
I
see
mean, not that we're hoping.
no, but there is a difference in freight market impact. Like a wind event will always generate more freight because it damages more infrastructure. Whereas a flooding event, it's a little bit different. With flooding, you've got to get rid of the water. It doesn't necessarily blow houses off their foundations and destroy things like a high wind event. I know I'm generalizing, but we see a very different freight impact. The wind event comes and goes pretty quickly, whereas the flooding hangs around for a long time, and it's hard to get in and out with the trucks. Whereas a wind event, it goes through, it does the damage, and then there's the massive rebuilding effort that's got to happen really fast. So different impacts based on the type of hurricane.
Got it. Got it. So what's next on the horizon? Like, what do you see on the horizon now? Obviously, we need still some numbers to come in for last month. But what if you were to give us or the audience kind of a 60-day prediction?
I think capacity is going to start to tighten, Dan. I think by the time we get to August, capacity's tighten and rates are starting to move up in a meaningful way. So the Logistics Managers Index, the LMI that Zach Rogers puts out from Colorado State University, the LMI is a survey-based index of all of the CSCMP supply chain professionals. So it's a little bit more logistics focused than the ISM Purchasing Managers Index. Now it is 8 separate indexes that make up the Logistics Managers Index. And there was one that moved this month that got my attention, and it was transportation capacity. And it decreased for the first time since March 2022. So capacity, as shippers see it, has been increasing, which means there's more trucks than loads. It turned for the first time since March 2022 and dropped from, I'm quickly looking it up, it dropped from, came in from 50, came in at 50. It was the first time it had dropped since the big freight downturn began in earnest. So when I see that from shipper's perspective, the capacity is tightening, that tells me that we're about to head into a market phase here where there's going to be sustained upward movement in rates, especially on the spot market. Now, contract rates will follow eventually, but for how long, I don't know. And that's what your shipper or the example of trying to lock in a 2-year rate is trying to hedge against, is they're trying to lock in that rate. We don't know how long it will be before contract rates start to reach parity and start to go up, where replacement rates are now higher than the rates they're replacing. We're not there yet. They're still going down on the other side of the equation.
It was interesting. You brought up the bed sheet customer, and I just happened to have a conversation with him today for the first time in quite a while. I mean, his business is very slow.
Right.
He's having issues with freight, with quality control, with selling products in the stores.
Right.
And he calls me up and he says, he goes, and I don't run his warehousing. And right. So he says, Dan, he goes, I just did a audit on my warehouse. And I said, okay. And he says, I'm wondering why it's costing me $30,000 a month in warehousing. And he says, when money was flowing, it was all good. And his business has actually, up until about 3 months ago, really increased because he's low end sheets. So I guess people watching their finances aren't going buying, Egyptian sheets. They're buying normal sheets. Yep. And so he was saying that it was, and up till about 3 months ago, all of a sudden he goes, it just fell off a cliff. And he goes, and it was really weird because the companies he works with started ordering 2/3 less. So his inventory went down to a third.
Right.
He says, obviously now that money's not flowing, I'm watching my dimes and nickels. And I was interesting. I go, so what did you figure out? He goes, I'm paying $30 a pallet storage. Storage.
Wow.
Yeah.
$30 a pallet.
$30 a pallet.
Per month.
And I said, per month. And I said, I guarantee you, it used to be 10. I said, I guarantee you those were COVID rates because everybody wanted warehouse during COVID. I said, so I guarantee, I said, I don't know what kind of numbers you got, right. But I said, I would be willing to put money down that your rates changed during COVID and you didn't know it, or they sent you something and you just keep paying the bills. And it was pretty normal for him. But he was like, well, what do I do? And I'm like, what do you mean? What do you do? I go, he goes, I got an opportunity to go, and this is what a lot of people are doing. It's actually the third person in the last 2 weeks that I've heard. So I shouldn't say a lot of people. I've heard it more and more. They're looking at outskirts of towns, like really small towns where buildings are super cheap.
Ah,
And they're starting to look at storage out there, like even Canadian Tires out here. They're looking in areas like Peterborough, like, which is 2.5, 3 hours from the GTA,
right.
because it's a third of the cost for a building. And so they're averaging and saying, no, if I move my freight costs, at 15% more for LTL,
Right.
somewhere nowhere close to the amount of money we're paying.
Yeah.
Because you just get guys going from Toronto, Montreal to bring the LTL into the right? So it adds another leg to their supply chain. But
Right.
so I think we're going to start seeing buildings go up in areas where you never thought warehouses were going to be.
That's
personally. I think that's the next step.
That changes the whole freight dynamic. Yeah.
I think it does.
Freight,
I think it does. I mean, I look at companies up in my small town, and I see more trucks now loading at facilities. Now, we're a big, like Warren Gibson passes through us going to the Honda plant in Alliston.
Yep.
So, I mean, we have a truck running up our main street every 3.5 minutes, going to the Alliston plant back and forth from Honda. But now we're seeing a lot. I'm noticing a lot more trucks going into companies here.
Huh.
Whereas before it was like straight trucks. You'd see a lot of straight trucks where they would just, they'd bring it down to the city and they'd come. And so I think it's changing a bit.
Huh.
I think the way people are processing all their freight is going to be shifting. And it's interesting because, I mean, I love watching these markets, right? And just seeing, and like, that's interesting. How would that work? And, so going over with my customer, I was like, okay, so you got a few things. You got to identify what it's going to cost you to move warehouse. Because if your new warehouse is $10,000 a month and it costs you $50,000 to move your warehouse, month one, you're paying $60,000.
Yep.
Right? So you're doubling that month free, and it's going to take you 3-4 months to recoup that initial $60,000. So I said, like, you got to understand that. And he's like, okay, and what about the company I'm with? I said, well, the company you're with is going to want to be paid up in full before they let your product leave. Like, the warehouse will hold it. They won't do, he goes, but I'm going to pay them. I go, it's irrelevant. They're going to want their money.
Right.
So then it's a matter of what's the shipping cost, both from a container perspective, because you got to remember his containers come into Mississauga. So now he's looking at going to Belleville, which is like 2.5 hours from Mississauga, probably close to 3, maybe even 4, depending on traffic.
Right.
To drop a container to unload, to either come back and go back and get it or wait there for it.
Wow.
So now what's going to happen is the dray companies you use are going to diminish.
Right.
Because a lot of them will be like, no, I don't have time to go all the way to Belleville. Right. And get stuck there for 3 hours while you unload a container, then come back. So you're talking a dray move that would normally take 35 minutes, drop at the dock, come back. When they bring the next one, they load the empty. To now 3 hours there, 3 hours back, just on the high side. Plus, if there's time there. So one container is now almost a full day's work.
Wow.
So now you got to think of that dray cost, right? You go from doing 6-7 containers a day to one.
Yeah.
What does that do?
And
he's like, I never even thought of that. I'm like, yeah, it's not as easy just to, and I think this is what, makes warehousing a very lucrative market. Is once customers are in, it's very expensive and very difficult to leave, which is probably why customers in warehouses put up with a lot of BS.
Dan, just go online now. We talked a lot about how warehouses have moved during the pandemic closer to populations to service our insatiable demand for what we want it yesterday.
Instantaneous goods.
Dan, I ordered stuff last night and on Amazon Prime, and it's like I ordered some bath mats for my truck. I had bath mats on the floor of my Peterbilt, and I thought, it won't be here before I go to the show in Walcott, Iowa. They said, and the option was, do you want it between 4 a.m. and 8 a.m. this morning? So I'm online at 8 o'clock last night, and the option was, do you want it between 4 and 8 a.m.? Like, no charge. Like, that's the window. And I thought, first of all, who's got bath mats in a warehouse somewhere within 50 miles of me, and you're going to deliver it in the morning? Like, I can't get my head around the economics of it. But
and who's going to drop it off at my house at 4 a.m.? My dog's going to go ape shit.
And I'm constantly amazed about how much freight is in warehouses so close to where I am. And of course, I'm not unique. It's all of us. There's a lot of warehouses that have a lot more inventory that are very close to us now. And I guess the economics work for Amazon, clearly.
Yeah. I mean, well, they have shut down a few warehouses. I
Right.
don't know if you heard about that, but I mean, and so, Amazon, I read an article, and I believe it was Amazon, has one of the most sophisticated management systems in place
Right.
ever seen in the world
Really.
to manage their inventory and what goes where. And like the analytics they have are unlike anything else. My CTO used to work at Amazon. He's like, you don't understand the analytics these people have. Like, it's insane. Well, I mean, the company, their largest profitable is AWS, right? The web services and
Right.
all that. So, yeah, it's crazy, man. It's insane. You got large companies saying, I'm going to buy every warehouse within 10 miles of major communities, and the smaller companies are getting pushed out to like so far beyond
Right.
where would be normal.
Right.
Like
Right.
it's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating.